Maureen Paraventi. I'm speaking today with Dusty Ott, CIH. Dusty is SKC's new corporate industrial hygienist. SKC Inc. is known for providing innovative solutions in the industrial hygiene and occupational safety spaces. Welcome, Dusty.
Welcome. Thanks so much.
Now, today we're going to be taking a look at the Mine Safety and Health Administration's final Silica rule. The rule is called Lowering Miners' Exposure to Respirable Crystalline Silica and Improving Respiratory Protection. And if I've mispronounced that, Dusty will help me out with it. So, Dusty, before we dig into the MSHA Silica rule, for short, I understand that you started your career at the gold mines in northern Nevada. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience there and what this new rule will mean for the mining industry?
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, I started my career in Elko, Nevada. I was lucky enough to have a couple different internships at the mines on subsequent summers. And I was able to spend time in the underground, on surface, in process, in maintenance. And so being able to have a really fun background, knowing that I wanted to go into mining was a great place to start. A fun note, me and my wife both are industrial hygienists. We both had internships in northern Nevada. We are both very familiar with the mining industry and the issues that the Silica rule will present. And some of those are, it's a lot of sampling. MSHA is very adamant about this new rule. They have gone really above and beyond to protect the health and safety of the miners. And we can get more into that as we go on, but it's going to be a big change for most mines, even those mines that have already done sampling in the past.
Sounds like you have an amazing background. You've touched on all the different areas of mining.
It's pretty fun. It was a good place to start a career, that's for sure.
Now, can you give us a short overview of the new, and I understand you're saying it, MSHA Silica rule and the health risks associated with breathing silica?
Yeah, we'll start with the health risks first, just to get those in the forefront. Breathing silica is very dangerous. It's not something that's going to hurt you in 1 day or in 2 days or in a couple months. Typically, it takes a lifetime of exposure of breathing very, very small particles. And you kind of said it in the title of the article, or the new rule, it's respirable. So it's particles that are small enough to get deep down inside of your lungs. And once they're there, your body doesn't have a natural defense to get rid of them. And so it causes damage deep in your lungs during the time that you're breathing silica, and even after the time, even after you left mining, per se, for years down the road, that silica would still be deep down inside of your lungs. And so as far as the overview, I have a couple notes because the rule is almost 300 pages long, and trying to boil that down into a couple bullet points, I've done my best. So first off, they lowered the exposure limit to 50 micrograms per cubic meter. That's 50 millionths of a gram. It's extremely, extremely low. It's roughly half of what it was before when you're looking at just respirable dust in general. Sampling has to be done on anyone who even might be exposed to silica. So in the past, if you were a control room operator, you didn't really spend too much time outside. If you have a chance to go outside to get exposed to any airborne crystalline silica, you have to be sampled. And that's going to include a lot of additional people that we never have sampled in the past. And so I think getting some good negative documentation should be fairly easy to do, but still it's additional sampling like we talked about earlier. We can no longer use SEGs or similar exposure groups in this new way of sampling. Employees have to be sampled on the same shift, the same task, and in the same work area. And so that limits the amount of similar exposure that you could get. Typically in the past, if you could sample 2 or 3 haul truck drivers per se underground, you could relatively assume that all of the haul truck drivers' exposures would be fairly similar if they were in the same equipment doing the same thing. But now there's day shift, there's night shift, there's multiple levels, there's hundreds of headings, And so how miners and how mine operators will determine the best way to move forward, again, it just means a lot of sampling for those mines. A big change is respiratory protection can no longer be used as a permanent solution. Again, referring to the past is if you were in a job, let's say you were a remote mucker, that means that you're basically driving a loader underground via a remote control, and you are right in the end of the heading, and it's a very, very dusty job. Even with water, even with all the controls that you can put in place, it becomes a very, very dusty job. And so typically in the past, those operators would wear respirators because there was no other way that we could reduce their exposure other than to have them in a respirator. And so now, moving forward, MSHA would not be a permanent means of fixing that problem. They would need to do some additional engineering controls, potentially even remove that miner from that work area and have them even more remote, whatever that might mean. So again, a lot of stuff to figure out before this rule really comes into play. Another big one is now when you get an exposure back from a miner and they're over that new 50 microgram per cubic meter exposure limit, you have to immediately notify MSHA. That's very, very different from the past. Typically, you would never really share your results with MSHA unless you were trying to go over a citation or something like that. But this is a big change. And then the last thing that I had written down is the medical surveillance has really been beefed up. It's a huge section all in itself, but just let it be said that I would definitely take some time reading through the medical surveillance program because it is quite big, I mean, it's very important to take care of the miners, but it's a little bit different than it was in the past. And that's kind of in a nutshell, 300 pages all squished down. Of course, there's so much more, but those are the ones that really kind of ring a bell that really make a big difference.
You've given us the major points.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, the rule does require that mine operators perform the sampling with samplers that are compliant with an ISO standard. What does that mean? And does SKC Inc. have sampling devices that meet this requirement?
Yeah, so it's a ISO 7708 1995 respirable curve. If you Google that, you can see that it's a nice kind of a wave in a sense that basically mirrors what our body does naturally. And what I mean by that is the small particles will make their way deep down inside of our lungs, whereas the larger particles will naturally, impact on your inside of your nose and your mouth. They won't make it all the way down into your lungs. And so what that ISO curve does is it mimics the way that our body naturally gets rid of these larger particles and can't really protect against the smaller particles. And so these samplers, whether they're cyclones, whether they're impactors, they have been designed to match the way that our bodies, breathe in a sense. And so they are collecting a very, very high percent of those small particles that are getting deep down inside of our lungs. And naturally, on the other side of the spectrum, they are not allowing very large particles to end up on the sampler because those large particles wouldn't end up in our lungs. It wouldn't be able to hurt us that way. And so we have a number of different cyclones. We have a number of different PPIs, which are parallel particle impactors. Coming from someone who's done a ridiculous amount of silica sampling in the past, cyclones can be very challenging. They are very orientation dependent. They need to be cleaned after every use. There's a lot of different situations where you don't know for sure if that sample will be valid because that cyclone might have tipped, might have turned upside down. The miner that was wearing it might not have been in the same orientation all day. It raises a lot of question marks if all of the samples are going to be accurate. And so that's why I really like the PPIs because it doesn't matter which way that is oriented, if they're laying on their back, if they're laying on their side, if they're tipping over, there's no orientation bias is what we call it. And so looking back at my, starting my career, just how many samples were voided or wasted because of tipping from cyclones. If I could have had PPIs back in the day, it would have been so much easier and the results that I got would be easier to trust. and knowing that the results we got back would be accurate. And so those are the solutions that the SKC has, and the PPIs are definitely the ones that I would suggest going with if you haven't had a chance to use them before.
Are real-time monitors allowed under the new rule?
So that's a really interesting question. Like in the rule specifically, you cannot use real-time monitors for compliance. So like the nice thing about real-time is it says it right in the name. It tells you real-time what your results are. And unfortunately, those are not, you can't use those for compliance samples. But the one thing that's interesting is MSHA encourages miners to use real-time monitors for engineering controls, meaning that if you were to take a sample and you were over the Pell for the new limit, you would need to go back and figure out what you're going to do to reduce that exposure. You put a control in place. Maybe you add water bars to the area. Maybe you add an additional water truck to the area. In between there, rather than taking additional personal samples full shift and sending to the lab to get analyzed and waiting weeks to get those results back, you could use a real-time monitor to see real-time if your control that you put into place is actually working. If you see that, oh man, like my results, they're still showing like I'm going to be high, I better put in some additional controls, and then we'll test that. And so it gives us a tool to be able to real-time see if the controls that we put in place are actually working. And if they are, great, we can get another compliance sample to prove that our controls worked. And if we see that those controls are not being as effective as we want, then we can kind of go back to that drawing board and put in some additional controls before we do some additional sampling to make sure that we're good.
And Dusty, what is the current timeline for compliance with this new silica rule?
So this is something that when people hear, they might think, oh, I have so much time, like I don't need to worry about that right now. But we have 12 months for coal mines to come into compliance, and we have 24 months for metal, non-metal to come into compliance. And that was back in April when it first came out. So we have April of next year for coal mines and April of 2026 for metal and non-metal mines. But the thing that I really want to drive home here is MSHA has given us this time to take advantage of the technology available, the time that we have to be able to come in compliance with these rules. I don't think they're going to be very favorable with mines that wait till the 11th hour to sample to figure out, oh no, like I'm in trouble. Like I have all these exposures that I need to take care of. I have all these engineering controls that I need to take care of, and I just don't have the time. And so I really encourage people to take advantage of as much time as we have left to take your samples, whether they're initial samples that you've never done before, or samples that you've already done to validate your controls, and be able to start putting the individual workers in different boxes per se to figure out, what controls need to be put into place to bring them below that exposure limit. There's a thing that I call the MSHA spin cycle, and it's this cycle that we have to go through once we have an overexposure. So we get an overexposure, we immediately notify MSHA. We then have to put our people in respirators until we can prove that that exposure is lower. Then we have to put in controls, we have to sample, and then once we get our sampling results back, if they're still over the Pell, then they're going back to that cycle again and again and again. Under the current rule, there's no provision to get out of that cycle unless you are below the ash limit, which is going to be very challenging for a lot of mines. And that's why it's very, very important to start now to be able to start figuring out what you need to do in order to reduce your workers' exposure. I'm hoping that at some point we have some additional clarification from MSHA on what else we can do. For example, if a mine was to spend millions of dollars at engineering all these controls, and even after all of the controls, they're still above the Pell, what then? Like, is MSHA going to come and close the mine down? Is there other provisions that we can do? Like, we just don't have answers yet, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some additional clarification in the future as that becomes available from MSHA.
Sounds like compliance assistance information is going to
Yes,
be.
ma'am. Yep.
What about mine operators who've never performed silica sampling in the past? What do they need to know?
So the biggest thing to come away is you have to do it. Like there's no getting out of it. If you are in a mining operation, people are going to be exposed to silica. With that said, is silica sampling these days has never been easier. Like the pumps are simpler to use than ever before. The sampling cassettes, like the PPI that I was mentioning earlier, makes sampling so much simpler than it did when I started my career. And so the takeaway is that there are people willing to help you. There's a whole technical team at SKC that's willing to help you. There's local sales reps that are willing to help you. There are people all around that are willing to help. Like this is a rule that's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And if mine operators cannot be in compliance, then they're going to have some serious reckoning to deal with. And so the community of mining as a whole wants them to succeed. And whether they're reaching out to SKC, their fellow industrial hygienists, or their local sales reps, like we're here to help. Like we want you to be successful. We want you to be able to get good samples so you can comply with the rule. And that's probably the biggest thing to take away, is that it's much easier than you think, and we are here to help.
Is there anything else we need to know about how SKC Inc. can help mine operators comply with the new final silica rule?
So we've done a couple different webinars over the last couple months, and those that want to learn a little bit more about the silica rule, like we have a pretty good breakdown of every section of that rule that would be available. It's on our website as well as available as a PDF. And again, we have a technical team that's willing to be here to help. Like my sole job is to help customers to be successful. And so the more that I can help interact with customers and put them at ease and help them to work through this process, the happier that I'm going to be, and the better off that they're going to be. So, I mean, our SKC has been around for over 60 years. We got in this business to help people, and that has not changed. Like we are still in that business, and that is one of my primary roles is to help people be successful.
And look at how you were just able to walk us through the major points of a 300-page rule. Whew! We would have needed a really, really long conversation for all that, but I think you hit the highlights for us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dusty. Dusty
Of course.
is SKC corporate industrial hygienist. And if you'd like to learn more about SKC's solutions for industrial hygiene and occupational safety, including compliance with the final silica rule, just visit skcinc.com. So thank you very much for watching.